As crowds gather before the Vatican in St. Peter's Square, the almost incredible news is released to the world. Pope John Paul I is dead.
It was the early hours of the morning on September 28, 1978, a day that would come to be marked by tragedy and mystery. The Vatican City, though bustling with the affairs of the Church, had a somber air as dawn approached. The dimly lit papal apartment stood at the heart of the Apostolic Palace, where Pope John Paul I had spent his final night. The once bustling corridors of the Vatican now felt strangely empty, as though holding their breath, awaiting the inevitable discovery that would send shockwaves across the world. Pope John Paul I, born Albino Luciani, was known for his simplicity, kindness, and warmth. Despite the relatively short period of his papacy, just 33 days, he had already earned the affection of Catholics around the globe. His deep sense of humility, his gentle nature, and his commitment to reform had many hopeful about the direction in which he might steer the Church. The papal apartment, although grand in its own right, had been decorated with modest taste. The furnishings were traditional, yet understated. A large, wooden desk covered in papers, the faint aroma of incense lingering in the air, and candles that were often lit by the Pope during his private prayers. A crucifix hung prominently on one wall, illuminated by the soft light filtering through the tall, arched windows. As was customary, the Pope had spent much of the evening in reflection and prayer. He was known to be deeply contemplative, even during the later hours of the evening, offering up prayers for the Church, for the world, and for the people he loved. In fact, he had reportedly been in good health the night before, eating a light dinner, receiving visitors, and discussing the future of the Church with trusted advisors. The night passed, and in the early morning hours of September 28, Father John McGee, Pope John Paul I's private secretary, was set to deliver his usual early morning report to the Holy Father. He entered the room, knocking softly on the door as he always did. But this time, there was no response. Alarmed, Father McGee entered the room, where the soft light of the early morning sun was creeping in through the curtains. The papal bed, where Pope John Paul I had been sleeping, looked eerily undisturbed at first glance. The linens were neatly arranged, but there was a sense of stillness that filled the room. Father McGee moved closer to the bed, his heart beginning to race. The Pope was not sitting up, as he often did, to begin his morning prayers. As he reached the bedside, his breath caught in his throat. Pope John Paul I was lying motionless on his back, his face pale and still, his hands folded across his chest. Despite the papacy's sudden and dramatic interruption, the Vatican initially offered the most straightforward explanation: heart attack. However, there were many who remained skeptical about this simple diagnosis. Pope John Paul I was only 65 years old, and he had appeared to be in relatively good health the night before. A man full of life, radiating warmth and vitality, his sudden, unexplained death left a deep sense of confusion and suspicion among those who had known him. The Vatican, however, moved quickly. There was little discussion, and the body of Pope John Paul I was quickly embalmed within hours of his death. This act was done to preserve his body for public view, but it also raised questions. Why was it done so quickly? Why no detailed investigation? These questions became the first hints that there may have been something more to the story than a simple heart attack. As news of the Pope's death spread, various theories began to take shape, theories that ranged from the plausible to the deeply conspiratorial. This was the official explanation. The Vatican attributed Pope John Paul I's death to a heart attack, citing his medical history of a weak heart. He had been feeling unwell in the days leading up to his death, complaining of slight fatigue and occasional dizziness. However, his physical condition had not been considered severe, and many found it unlikely that he would have suddenly succumbed to a heart attack at such an early hour, after a night that seemed peaceful and uneventful. The most persistent and popular conspiracy theory centers around the idea of poisoning. Many believe that the Pope's sudden death was not due to natural causes, but rather the result of a deliberate act. Some pointed to the fact that there had been poisonous substances reportedly found in the Vatican's papal kitchen, possibly even strychnine, a toxic substance known for its use in historical assassinations. Some theorists suggested that Pope John Paul I was poisoned to silence him because of his growing discontent with certain corrupt elements within the Vatican, including the Church's financial dealings, specifically with the Vatican Bank. The connection to the Vatican Bank was not only a possibility but a serious one. At the time of Pope John Paul I's election, the Vatican Bank was embroiled in financial scandals, including illicit dealings with the Banco Ambrosiano, which would later collapse in 1982. Some believe that the Pope had begun to question the Vatican's financial transparency, particularly regarding ties to the bank's questionable activities. His death was seen by some as a way to prevent him from investigating these matters, which may have had powerful enemies within the Church. Another theory involved the internal politics of the Vatican. Some suggested that Pope John Paul I's reformist views were too bold for certain factions within the Church, especially those who held significant power within the Curia. These factions, concerned about the potential changes to the Vatican's structure and influence, might have acted to remove him from power. The room itself seemed to tell a story of its own, filled with subtle symbols and eerie quiet. The bed remained undisturbed, save for the faint, lingering imprint of the Pope's body. The white linens of the bed appeared almost untouched, pristine, as if the Pope had simply lain down to rest and never awoke. Candles, often lit by the Pope during his evening prayers, stood unmoved in their holders on a nearby table, their flames extinguished long before. On the small wooden desk, there were papers and letters that seemed to tell of a future the Pope would never see. Documents referencing meetings, discussions of reform, and messages about Vatican finances. An open Bible lay open at a passage, a subtle symbol of Pope John Paul I's deep connection to his faith, his reverence for prayer, and his role as the spiritual leader of millions. The crucifix on the wall, once illuminated by the soft rays of the morning sun, seemed to stand as a silent witness to the Pope's final moments, and perhaps as a reminder that the truth behind his death was still, to this day, unknown. In the wake of his death, Pope John Paul I was succeeded by Pope John Paul II, who would go on to become one of the most influential popes in history. However, the shadow of his sudden and unexplained death lingered. Despite the official explanation of a heart attack, many continued to question what had truly happened in the papal apartment that fateful morning. Over the years, books, documentaries, and investigations have continued to speculate on the cause of Pope John Paul II's death. Yet, the Vatican has maintained its stance that no foul play was involved, and the truth may never be fully known. Pope John Paul I remains a figure of intrigue, a man who, in his brief time as Pope, touched the hearts of many and who, in his final days, perhaps unknowingly set the stage for questions that remain unanswered to this day. The death of Pope John Paul I, though officially attributed to natural causes, has been shrouded in mystery and speculation for decades. Whether due to political intrigue, corruption, or even a desire for reform, the unanswered questions surrounding his death continue to haunt the Vatican. Yet, perhaps it is his legacy of humility and his vision for change that remain his most enduring marks on the Church. A legacy that, like the man himself, was tragically cut short.